going to see. I passed a little bit of a flyer out. These are not tombstones. These are people. And to me, they're very personal people. The Bucktails was one of the most famous units in the entire Civil War. Tad Lincoln wore a bucktail in his hat. That's to give you an idea of what of an honor it was to wear a bucktail. They came from 10 different counties altogether. It was roughly 1,200 in all. Curwensville supplied 123 of those, what they called Company K. Well, Company K, for some strange reason, ended up with more bucktails buried in this cemetery than anywhere else on earth. Of all those 10 counties, it's hard to find more than 1 or 2 bucktails in any cemetery. There's 45 bucktails buried here. What's really impressive is the ranks. The bucktails pretty much ended up under the influence of the boys from Curwensville. You'll recognize the names, but the ranks go from second lieutenants, captains, majors, lieutenant colonels, and the only brigadier general from Clearfield County during the entire war are all buried here. They all wore bucktails. Curwensville at the time had 450 people, so they must have been really special. Lincoln knew them well. To begin here, we're going to be starting off with the playing of taps. Thank you. Good job. We'll try to stay together. I think I can find all the people I am talking about. There's 10 individuals that will be visiting. And I'm not good on names and dates. I'm good at what they did. And I'll try to tell you something that I thought was interesting about each one. The first one to go to is a man by the name of J. Elliott Kratzer. All the records call him John Elliott. It's not, it's Jesse. His brother John was killed on the first day of the Second Battle of Bull Run. The Kratzers lost 3 boys in that battle, or in that war. Okay, got one more group coming. Those of you who have the papers and can share them, you might want to pass one to them. All right, are there any questions before we get going? It's going to get dark before we get finished, so off we go like a herd of turtles. Keith, you want to bring the colors?
Not you. Did you put that one down there?
On of Captain Kratzer, and it says Company 8, 190th Pennsylvania Volunteers. We'll get back to that story. He started out as a sergeant in Company K from Curwensville. The boys had lots of names thrown at them. They were called the 13th Pennsylvania Reserve when they first got in action. Then they changed the name to the 42nd Pennsylvania Volunteers. The name they liked most was the 1st Pennsylvania Rifles. Any of those names means the same thing. They're all bucktails. What I like about Elliott Kratzer, I'll tell you a couple of stories about him. The place you may have heard of called Gettysburg, Elliott had just been promoted to a lieutenant. They charged down Little Round Top, right into the thick of a Confederate brigade. The colonel, the youngest colonel in the entire U.S. Army's history, was right beside Kratzer when they ran into the Johnny Rebs. And they shot him down. And he fell into the arms of Elliot Kratzer. Immediately, Kratzer noticed a Johnny Reb officer who took a pistol shot at him. Missed him. Kratzer fired back. He missed. The Confederate fired another shot and missed. Kratzer fired back and missed. The Confederate fired a third time. Hit Kratzer. Kratzer fired back, killing that Confederate officer. Now that little incident probably happened faster than I could tell it. But can you imagine there standing while he shoots at you, you shoot at him, and you keep missing? Well, the other story I like about Elliot Kratzer, and gives you an insight into who he was. By the time that they were ready to pay off, they were 3-year volunteers. At the end of 3 years in 1864, they were going home. So their time was short. But from 1,200, they were down to less than 250. It was so bad in the companies, each company was supposed to have a little over 1,000 men. It was so bad in the companies that there was teens, sometimes less. And Company H was so bad off they had no non-commissioned officers and no officers at all left. So J. Elliot Kratzer was transferred to Company H. Company H was the color company. They carried the flag. Any Civil War soldier would tell you, for us, that's home. That's where we all know where we're supposed to be. Bucktails were at a place called Guinea Station. It was late in the war. It was hot in the summer of '64. And they were on the skirmish line all day. What they normally did. Skirmish line means they're not in a solid line. They're out plinking back and forth at the Johnny Rebs constantly. They got the word, pull back. Finally, 24 hours on the line, we're finally going to get some rest. No, we want you to move this direction as fast as you can move. They had to change fronts 30 miles. They never stopped. They never got any rest. They literally marched through the camps of the rest of the Union Army. And they said they could see the men sleeping as they were ordered to assemble on the other side of the entire army. They were changing fronts. When they finally got to the headquarters of the 250, there was 15 men and 6 officers. They call that straggling. Bucktails were noted never to straggle. This time they straggled. Straggling means you can't keep up. They're forced to fall out. So the Bucktails, the whole way on that 30-mile march, started to fall out. But when they got to the other end, they came up through a guard unit of over 500 men and were told, you're to deploy forward, all 21 of you, up against a Confederate division of 15,000. They did what they did best. The 15 of them went forward. Now the color company, for the first time in its history, the entire color guard was forced to fall out. Nobody was carrying the colors. J. Elliot Kratzer had them over his shoulders. And as one of the men put, our brave lieutenant, over his strong shoulders, brought the colors to the front. They went forward, and they could hear the Johnny Rebs when they saw them. Tain't no militia. Tain't no militia at all. Militia don't carry knapsacks and wear bucktails in their hat. That's the Army of the Potomac. And the rebels started to pull back. They didn't want to deploy against 21 bucktails. Well, the 21 bucktails just opened fire, peppering them one particular officer who was trying to get his men to go forward lost 2 horses, and they finally shot him. As the day wore on, more of that 250 of the rest of the Bucktail Regiment came forward. By nightfall, they were all back in line. I think that says a lot about Kratzer, doesn't it? Now here's one of the saddest parts. I've sort of adopted Captain Kratzer. In his old age, his wife was died, and his children were all long gone, and he was living alone when his house burned down. He lost everything. But luckily, the neighbors took him in. They applied to have his pension turned over to them. So the government, being as sharp as the government always is, sent an inspector around. He interviewed Kratzer and promptly went back and wrote a report. He said, he gets animated. Cancel his pension. He doesn't deserve a pension. Well, the family finally got a hold of their U.S. congressman, and he came in and interviewed Kratzer. He said he's unable to get out of bed. He can't stand, but he still has his cane. And when he talks about the good old days and his boys, he shakes his cane. He's very animated about the boys. Well, a few weeks later, they got notice that his pension was restored. Unfortunately, at that time, Captain Kratzer had been buried here. I think that's one reason why we should remember him. I try to make sure that he gets a red geranium every Memorial Day. That's their holiday. They called it Decoration Day, and their flower was a red geranium. If we go through here, maybe some of you might adopt one of these graves and see that they get a red geranium, or at least some kind of notice on Memorial Day. That's their day. That's Elliot Kratzer. Now we go this way, and hopefully I can find the next one.
Okay. Just wait.
This is Captain John Norris. He was with Elliot Kratzer, one of the original sergeants of Company K. You notice that he puts on his monument Company K 1st PA Rifles. It's all the same outfit. That was probably the name they appreciated most. Rifles were elite, and these boys were elite. These boys were literally the Navy SEALs of the day. They were always out front. But always being out front put them into a lot of danger. In 1862, the war was about over. Richmond was surrounded. They were sort of working their way in. The war was going to be over in a few weeks. Company K and the rest of the Bucktails were sort of sent out on a scout at the Chickahominy Swamps near a little town called Mechanicsville. They're told, don't take any haversacks, no food or anything. You'll be back in a couple of hours. Okay. So off they went. Well, the commanding general of the rebels, Joe Johnson, had been wounded. Heaven forbid, oh my God, the rebels were saying, we've got to put Granny Lee, King of Spades, the man who's been digging trenches around Richmond, we got to put Granny Lee in charge of the army. The war is lost. Well, within a week, the Johnny Rebs were consolidating around Richmond. He was bringing men from all over. When he was done, after 7 days, they call it the 7 days, the U.S. Army was on the James River with the United States Navy and as close as it could stand with their big guns keeping Granny Lee from taken over the entire army. Unfortunately, the Bucktails, being far advanced, and Company K from Curwensville being the farthest advanced, got captured when 30,000 rebels came in between them and the rest of the army. It was sort of a reason for them not to head back. Well, they ended up in Libby Prison. Now, Libby Prison was a long, two-story tobacco shed with windows all across the second floor with a nice wall around it. Well, John Norris, who sort of stood out, he was 6'2", in a time when it was rare to be more than 5'8". There were several 6-footers in Company K. Well, John sort of stood out. While in Libby Prison on the second floor, they were playing a game of poker. He threw in his hand and he turned to the boys and says, "Well, boys, I've decided I'm going to go home." Everybody, you know how it is. Yeah, sure. And they watched him get up, walk over to the stairs, walk down the stairs. At this point, everybody's at the windows looking out, and you could see over the wall. Out the front door came John Norris. He walked up to the front gate and with one punch knocked the guard totally out. He walked through the gate, and on the far side was a truce wagon, a Union wagon under a flag of truce that was exchanging prisoners. He just crawled up on the wagon box, sat down on the seat next to the driver, and when the rebels come running out, he just pointed. "I'm under a flag of truce. I'm under a flag of truce." He went home. Now, needless to say, things changed slightly. After that, they had 4 armed guards on the gate at all times, and a corporal's guard of about 40 other men right there at all times. Sort of seems that John Norris sort of changed the, let us say, the conditions of how you guard Libby Prison. John eventually ended up being one of the top sergeants in Company K. His time was up, like his good friend Elliot Kratzer. They figured the war was not going to be won by draftees and bounty dodgers who were coming up. They needed men who had, quote, learned the soldiering trade. Boy, these boys had learned the soldiering trade. So they re-enlisted into a brand new unit called the 190th. But the 190th was something special. It's called the 1st Pennsylvania Veteran Reserves. Remember I said Bucktail started out as the 13th Reserves? Well, the Pennsylvania Reserves were the most heavily fought unit in the entire Civil War. They took more casualties, fought in more engagements, and took more battle honors than any other unit. Sergeant John Norris went in as captain of Company K of the 190th. Most of them, the boys from Curwensville's Company K. They started out with 123. By this time, when they mustered out after 3 years, there were 19 left. 16 of them re-enlisted. They stayed with John Norris. And they filled out the rest of the company with members of the Pennsylvania Reserves, the boys that they kept elbow to elbow, the touch of elbows. That's John Norris, captain. Go to the next one.
Did you put this one on?
No, I didn't make it down. That's gonna do.
This is Lieutenant Albert B. Cole. Now, he's not from the 13th Reserve, the 1st Rifles. Seems a year later, Curwensville sent a second company and another regiment called the 149th Pennsylvania Volunteers, the New Bucktails. Well, Albert was one of the youngest members. He was just 18 when he joined. Their first battle was a place you may have heard of called Gettysburg. We'll talk about Gettysburg and the 149th a little later. It was a real wake-up for the 149th. The old Bucktails really didn't like the fact that they showed up wearing bucktails in their hats, even though they were their relatives, brothers, fathers, uncles, best friends. How dare you show up a year later wearing a bucktail in your hat after what we've done? At Gettysburg, they earned the right to wear the bucktail. At that point, Albert was a sergeant. And on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, he was badly wounded, and he was in a barn. If you go to Gettysburg, you can see that barn today. It's called McPherson's barn. It's a big stone barn with white wooden trim all around it. After the battle was over, one of the first people who showed up was a minister, traveling minister from Curwensville, who had gone south to pick up his good horse and ended up behind the lines. And as he was riding out, he stopped into that barn. He said it was pitch dark and he couldn't see anybody, but it was like a moving mass on the inside of wounded, because that's where they were crawling to take care of each other. He said, "Is there anybody from Clearfield County here?" And back in the back he says, "Yes, Reverend Gardner, it's me, Albert Cole. I'm a member of your church. Don't you remember me?" Go on 2 more years. Albert has now been promoted to a lieutenant. He's just turned 21 about 10 days ago. They get sent out. It's February. It's raining, snowing. The ground is mud and it's ice. It's changing constantly. The men have had nothing to eat, no sleep, and there's no cover for them. They're soaking wet in a uniform like this. Believe me, wool likes to hold water. They were told that they were to attack a place called the Weldon Railroad, and they did. 149th Company B, Albert's unit, well, it lost 6 men. Amos Rowell, the lieutenant, the other lieutenant, was wounded. 4 other men were wounded but got off the field. But Albert was left in the mud as they had to retreat. No fires when they got back. They were in the mud, no tents. It's freezing rain. And they just stuck in their craw. We left Albert, our young lieutenant, back on Hatcher's Run. So the boys of Company B crawled almost a mile through that freezing mud and through that icy rain. They crossed Hatcher's Run waist deep in icy water. They went in under the guns of the Confederates. They found their beloved Albert Cole, and they drug his body back through that muddy battlefield, back across that raging creek that was Hatcher's Run, and back to where he was safe. Every time I come here, I think of the family that stood here when he was buried. And I think of those boys that could not leave Albert Cole laying on the battlefield. Didn't matter that they were cold. Didn't matter that they were freezing. It didn't matter that they had to literally crawl through a raging stream. They went back to get him. He was killed on February 6, 1865. 6 weeks later, the war was over. Little too late for Albert. I salute you, Albert. Wish somebody would adopt him and make sure he gets a geranium once a year. I think he deserves it.
Bring it down, go ahead.
Here, go over there and follow her, not me. The teacher.
This is Lieutenant D.C. Dale. Can't be 100% sure what his first name was. The Army says it was David, but all of his letters are signed Dennis. Unfortunately, he hasn't been around to tell anybody what the right name was. He went with D.C. a lot, so we're going to stay with what is on his tombstone. He also has 1st Rifles Pennsylvania RVC, which meant Pennsylvania Reserve Volunteer Corps, the original unit. Lieutenant Dale was like Kratzer and Norris. He was one of the original sergeants. The sergeants were very close together. They were what they called man and man. They shared the same tent. If you think brothers are close, or you think man and wife are close, get to men who are in combat every day sharing the same tent. And their tent is about 2.5 feet high and is 5'9". I know Norris was 6'2". Norris was always out in the weather, one end or the other. They took care of each other. They're the only guys that would really know what it was like after you saw the literal hell of war. And these guys were living right in the middle of it. Lieutenant Dale wrote a lot of letters. And thanks to Julie Farwell, some of you may know her from her old,
Yeah,
you've met her, yeah. She's from Grampian. She managed to find somebody who had a bunch of his letters. And that person would not let her photocopy them. But he did allow her to hand transcribe most of it, but not the last few. He sent them away to his son in Virginia. Dale, if you read his letters, and I just reread them again tonight, the main thing that these boys were so desperately seeking was news from home. I've written 5 letters in the last week. In the last month, I have gotten none. Can't somebody write me a letter? Oh yeah, the letters were being written. It's just they weren't making it to the Army. They were worried about, did you get the wheat crop in? How's the fruit doing? Can you make it through the winter? They were desperate to know what things were like at home and how their friends were. Dale especially worried about his family. He was sick a lot, but sickness went around the Army a lot. At Antietam, the Bucktails, Company K, had lost all of its head officers. Ed Irvin was down. The lieutenant colonel was down. Lieutenant D.C. Dale took command of what was left of the shattered Bucktails. They took a heavy toll. We'll talk about that later. As you read his letters, you can see that he's constantly depressed about how the war is going. He gets very depressed, and I wish I had those last letters. Because on February 17th, 1863, Lieutenant D.C. Dale shot himself, committed suicide. He was aged just 32 years. I always think about how bad it must have been in his unit that he couldn't go on another day. Lieutenant Dale, I salute you. John P. Bard caused me a lot of headaches. When I did research for the Bucktail Monument downtown, I kept coming up with the name Patton Bard, and I could not find a Patton Bard. John's middle name is Patton. And I found out at this time a large number of people used their middle name and just ignored their first name. J. Elliott Kratzer, John Patton Bard. Patton Bard is a really interesting character. He did something that I think helped me more than anything else. He owned a newspaper after the war called the Curwensville Herald, a weekly. And he wrote a serial on the Bucktails, where we were and what we did. And it was from right here in Curwensville. I think that's the best story of the Bucktails I have ever read. It tells you more information about them. I was lucky. Before it was published by the Curwensville Historical Society, and you can get it down there, John Bard's history of the Bucktails, I read his scrapbook where he had cut out the individual sections and pasted them in the scrapbook. What was really interesting, there was a lot of arrows and circles leading to the margin where he had notes. Some of the notes were kind of interesting. The very first battle Company K got into was down in Maryland, a place called New Creek. They're all hot to fight. They've never been in a battle before. John Patton Bard is not just the sergeant. He's the first sergeant. That's the top sergeant. They're in this brick house. Lo and behold, down the road in front of them comes charging the famous Black Horse Cavalry. Its regimental commander was a guy you may have heard of, James Ewell Brown Stewart. He sort of liked to abbreviate the initials to J.E.B., Jeb Stewart, probably the best cavalry commander who's ever lived from the United States. Well, that troop of cavalry charged down on the Bucktails in that brick house. A few of the boys, according to Bard, were out front in the courtyard, coolly taking aim and shooting the lieutenant in charge out of the saddle. He was shot by one of the sergeants. But if you read the scrapbook, there's a note coming out. That sergeant was me. This was the first casualty they had taken, the first fight they had been in. So they all ran over to where this young lieutenant lay dead. And some of them said, well, we got to go through his pockets and take what he has. Well, somebody went to take the wedding ring off, and while they were going through his other effects, they found letters from his wife. He was just newly married. He was a newlywed. So instead of keeping the wedding ring and the other effects, John Bard and the Bucktails packaged them all up and sent them across the lines to his newly minted widow. That's when the war still had some honor. Believe me, it didn't stay that way long. One of the things Pat and Bard said, no cavalry unit in its right mind 6 months later would charge infantry in a brick house. It's stupid and insane, and you just get people killed. Well, after they had fired, the Bucktails came out of the house and chased the cavalry down the road. And as Bard said, and no infantry unit in its right mind would dare get caught in the open to one of the best cavalry units the world has ever seen. But that was 6 months later. John Patton Bard, at the end, was the last captain of Company K. When they all mustered out, John Patton Bard was with them. Of the 19 men, 16 re-enlisted. One of the 3 who didn't re-enlist was John Patton Bard. He had had his share. Instead, he went home and wrote about what the boys had done. If you want to read something that I think is the best history, go to the Curwensville Historical Society and buy that book, History of the Bucktails by John Patton Bard.
Yeah, that'll be fine.
Most people in Curwensville have heard of the Irvins. They presented this piece of property to Curwensville to have a cemetery. This is John Irvin. As I said, there was 2 units of Bucktails. A year after the first unit, the 13th Reserve, the 1st Rifles had come in. Company B of the 149th recruited. John Irvin recruited it. As I said, they thought that they were going to be elite troops and went in with the Bucktails in their hats. When they showed up, they got called by their friends and relatives the bogus Bucktails. To add insult to injury, the Army didn't use them for what the Bucktails thought they should be used for. Instead, only the Army put them on guard duty. They guarded railroad crossings, they guarded downtown Washington City, they guarded the brothels in Washington City, supported by the government. Finally, a year later, they got notice that they had to head home to Pennsylvania as fast as they could march. That Johnny Reb, by the name of Robert E. Lee, is now loose in Pennsylvania. And he was threatening Harrisburg and Carlisle. The Army had to find him. new Bucktails, as they were called, were one of the first units in the field. They made a blazing hard march from Washington City, 60 miles, to where they were outside of a little town called Gettysburg. And they got their first baptism of fire. They went in with 450 men. They fought for 5 solid hours. They were even hit from 3 sides. Their color guard was cut down and they lost their colors, not because they surrendered them, but because the color guard was dead. Of the 450 who went in, 5 hours later, there were 112 left. John Irvin, who started out as a captain of Company B, had been promoted to adjutant. The adjutant sort of does the paperwork. He's an officer and he just sort of does the paperwork. Well, on that day, the officers all went down. John Irvin ended up in command of what was left of his Bucktails. I read a diary that I think says a lot. It was written by a young boy. He had taken a bullet and pounded it out to make a pencil out of it. And he was sitting around the campfire the night of the first day at Gettysburg, and he said, "Oh, where are the boys? Oh, where are the boys?" This morning, 50 of us sat around our campfire. There's 5 left. I saw a paw go down. I ran to him and he said, "For God's sake, don't shame us. Fall back in." He said, "I also saw my uncle and my brother go down." But I went forward. We don't know where they're at. We don't know how many are dead, how many are wounded, how many are in the barn with Albert Cole. Oh, where are the boys? Oh, where are the boys? The old Bucktails saw what they did. And grudgingly, they said, "You earned your Bucktails this day." And after that, there was a lot of razzing back and forth between old Bucktails and new Bucktails. But they all remembered what happened at Gettysburg. John Irvin went to the rank of major and then to full colonel in charge of the regiment. And he commanded it through until the end of the war. He was one of the most trusted officers in the Army. Captain or Colonel Irvin. If you've heard of the famous Colonel Irvin in Curwensville, this is one of them. Supposedly he's buried in uniform. This is Captain William Holden of Company B. It says on the tombstone Company R, but Company stop at K, so it should have been Company B. I couldn't find a lot about what he did, but he was in command of Company B after John Irvin was promoted. I think a very telling thing is he resigned in 1865. If you look at his tombstone, he died in January of 1865. Hard campaigning. This was very hard campaigning. And I think he was just one of the boys who was just totally worn out. And he took it as long as he could, but he died a couple weeks after he resigned. So I think that says a lot about him. This Patton. And he's really, I think, interesting. First of all, he didn't have a flag on his grave. He does now. Harry D. Patton was in his 40s, and he went to be with the original Bucktail Company K. But he was 40, and they sent him home. He wasn't ready to give up. He made his own way down to Camp Curtin, ready to join up. But Company K had already elected their officers and was already full up. But the regiment needed a quartermaster. The quartermaster had to be an officer. Harry Patton was one of John Irvin's storekeepers. He knew how to run inventories and the like. So a plan was hatched. Company F from Ma Chunk. Today they call that Jim Thorpe. I think they should have stayed with Ma Chunk. Company K from, or Company F from Ma Chunk had one officer slot left open. Patton joined Company F, was immediately elected as a lieutenant, and within a few weeks he was promoted quartermaster for the regiment. Now, that's a staff job. Somebody who's 40, okay, that makes sense. But one of the things about Harry D. Patton is he kept going up. From the regiment to the brigade, which was 3 regiments, to the division, which was 9 regiments, and finally the 5th Corps. And he's in charge of everything you could ever want. And he was from Curwensville. Now, one of the nice things is, when they first had their first winter camp, Company K thought, boy, if we only had some axes and some shovels, we could really build some nice log huts here. Well, guess what? The quartermaster sent down a whole lot of wagons full of shovels, picks, axes, and saws, and horses. As the boys said, we were skidding logs with some of the best horses they'd ever seen, wild Mustangs from the New Mexico territory. They said they were the best horses they ever saw. All the other outfits were wondering, how did the Bucktails end up with all this equipment and get all this help? Well, they sort of knew the quartermaster. Now the quartermaster, he's way in the rear. He's with all the equipment. Well, if you remember, we talked about Mechanicsville and how the Bucktails had been pushed forward when Bobby Lee, the King of Spades, all of a sudden became the Gray Ghost, or the Morris Robert, as the rebels call him. He saw what was happening. He knew that they were going to be cut off. He's a staff officer. He's way in the rear. He mounts up on his horse and he takes off. Down into the swamps he goes. He sneaks through the Confederate line, 30,000 Confederates. And they were a rather good group of Confederates. It was Stonewall Jackson's foot cavalry, they called themselves. He snuck his way through and he found Ed Irvin. And he said, Ed, you can't go back the way you came. You're going to get captured. There are thousands of them coming in behind you. Go this way or go that way, but you can't go back. You'll be captured. There were 2 other companies out. He says, I'm going to go and find the other 2 companies. And find them he did. He snuck through the enemy lines several times. Found the other 2 companies and personally led them back. Company K, unfortunately, went another direction, and after 5 or 6 days with no food and their gunpowder all having drawn damp, they had no choice but to surrender. That's how they got to Libby Prison. They never thought or forgot about Harry D. Patton, the quartermaster, staff officer in the rear, mounting up and riding through the line several times and bringing the men home. I think that says a lot about Harry D. Patton. He ended the war quartermaster to the 5th Corps. 5th Corps was 15,000 men, and the best corps in the Army. Major? Okay. You go this way.
Got music. Peter, no. Oh,
This is William Ross Hartshorn, another one of those people who went by his middle name more than anything else. Ross was one of the original lieutenants of Company K. During that charge down Little Round Top at Gettysburg, all the other officers were shot and killed, all the ranking officers. Ross Hartshorn had just been promoted major. He's in charge at Gettysburg. This wasn't new to him. A year before, they were at a place called Antietam. They had lost colonels, lieutenant colonels, and the major. And Hartshorn, then the adjutant, took over command at Antietam. So here he is, battle hardened and taking over at Gettysburg. Hartshorn is probably one of the bravest soldiers you'll ever meet. He, trying to think which story to tell. He commanded at Gettysburg, and then he was a major. He should be a colonel. He's in command. But he's not a colonel, because the governor would not sign his commission. The Army wanted him to be a colonel, but he was in the Pennsylvania Reserve Corps, and the governor had to sign him. Governor Curtin didn't want anything to do with Ross Hartshorn. They had a major feud going. So as the Bucktails continued to fight, led by this wonderful leader, he stays a major. Now, there's different stories about him, but I think one of my favorite ones comes from one of their reunion booklets. And it was a letter written by a Chill Hazard. They really knew how to have names in those days, didn't they? Well, Chill Hazard was the lieutenant, and he was on the staff of General Meade. And down came an order to go to the Bucktails. He said, I always hated to try to deliver a message to the Bucktails. I knew where they were going to be. They're going to be way out in front of everybody else, and they're going to be on an active firing line. He says, I just absolutely hated it. But when he finally found them, as he's riding up, they're on the brow of a hill. Most of the men are either on their bellies or kneeling down, just sort of plinking at the enemy. And he said all along the line he could see bullets hitting the ground. Small woods there, so he pulled off, and there, just below the brow of the hill, there was a spring house. All the officers were behind the spring house. The spring house was full of ice. Hartshorn and the rest of the officers were all behind the spring house with their tin cups full of ice, full of water. Hartshorn sees Hazard and says, "Don't bring your good horse across that field. You'll get him shot for sure." Hazard says, "Okay, I can hear that. He can hear me." So he starts yelling back. And Hartshorn says, "Hey, what's that you say? Come a little closer." So he came a little closer and he yelled a little bit more after tying his horse to a tree. As he put it, he said, "Deafer ears there never were than those that do not wish to hear." He said, "Finally I had no choice but to hitch up my sword and start legging it across that field as fast as I could." He said, and of course I was being encouraged by all the bucktails who I was running behind. "Come on, Lieutenant, you can make her. Those rebels can't shoot. Come on, you can make it." He says, "I finally got into the back of that spring house, and Hartshorn handed me a tin cup full of ice, water, and mint, and whatever brand of O.B. Joyful they could find at the time." O.B. Joyful is also called knockhead, or anything they could call whiskey. As they said, they were sipping mint juleps behind the spring house. Said, so I had a stiff mint julep, gave the message. Hartshorn gave me a second tin cup and said, "Drink this up, and good luck getting across the field again." He said, I hitched up my sword once more and ran back across. He said, luckily the bullets hit all around me, but I never got hit. He said, but I'll never forget that. Oh, and by the way, I have read in several places that Ross Hartshorn all of his life was a total teetotaler. Apparently they never talked to Chill Hazard, did they? When the Bucktails paid off on June 11th, 1864, like I said, they had their 3 years up. When they started the new regiment, the 190th, Ross Hartshorn got his commission from the U.S. Army as a colonel. Most of the old Bucktails re-enlisted with him. They even carried the Bucktail battle flag with them. Unfortunately, life was hard on the 190th, all these veteran volunteers. They were told to attack a place called the Weldon Railroad. And they were brigaded with several brand new regiments. The new regiments broke and ran, leaving the 190th out all alone, and the whole outfit was captured. Most of the boys went to Andersonville, then to Salisbury, and then to Danbury. Each one worse and worse and worse. One day, a Confederate officer come down and said, I've got orders for Colonel Hartshorn of the Bucktails. He also had orders for a major whose father just happened to be a U.S. congressman. This is probably good news. That means we're going to get exchanged. Sure enough, they went to Libby Prison where the exchanges were taking place. But instead of being released, they were taken deep down into the basement to a 5 by 9 foot cell with a stone floor, chained hand and foot together. It was just a small little grate leading out to the street was all the light they had. Very little food, and didn't know what they were up for. Finally, the Confederates said, we're going to hang you two. It seems that there's been a few spies captured in Missouri, and they are going to be hung. we're going to hang you two, a Bucktail colonel and a congressman's son, in retaliation. Well, as the weeks went by, there were negotiations happening, and finally President Lincoln personally got involved and said, "This is ridiculous. Let's exchange those men right now." One day, Hartshorn heard the jingling of keys as they came down and opened his door. He nudged the good major, said, "They're taking us out." The good major was dead. Hartshorn was brought out at 87 pounds. He wasn't a big man, but he had lost half of his weight. Luckily, he got sent back under a flag of truce and exchanged. Lincoln didn't forget this. He never got to the point to where he was in good enough shape to have active field command. But Lincoln appointed him a brigadier general, one of the very few that Lincoln personally approved. And as a brigadier general, he became the inspector general for the entire 5th Corps, the one that Harry D. Patton was the quartermaster of. It was the 5th Corps took the surrender of Robert E. Lee's army a few months later. I think we need to remember Brigadier General Ross Hartshorn, the only general officer from Clearfield County during the Civil War. And a note of how times have changed. On his tombstone, you'll see the shoulder straps with a star in the middle of them. That's Brigadier General. His wife also has shoulder straps with no star on them. Nothing at all. That's a 2nd lieutenant. So, how times have changed. You see, there's nothing on that. And there's the star, Brigadier General. One more. Here lies Lieutenant Colonel Edward A. Irvin. He's the one that really started the Bucktails in Curwensville. When the war started, he said, "I know the right boys who can fight a war. My loggers, my farmers in Curwensville." And he recruited Company K. Irvin was considered one of the best officers in the Army. He was at a place called South Mountain. He was newly promoted to Lieutenant Colonel. So he's leading a charge up South Mountain. If you've ever been up the Anderson Creek side hill, you know it's all rocks, all laurel, just nasty territory and very steep. Ed was leading his charge, leading his men. As he turned to urge the men forward, he was struck by a musket ball in the back of the head, which promptly ran around to his back, hit his backbone, ran down the backbone, hit a rib bone, and ran out and stopped in his chest. Well, the Army considers that a mortal wound. Remember, there's no antiseptic. That ball, when it went in, it took pieces of hat, scalp, hair, and who knows what else with it. And that's all going to be infected. But Irvin's mother, Jane Patton, came down, and along with his servants, he had hired a freed slave, Elisha Only. They nursed him and brought him back to Curwensville. And in spite of everything, he recovered. He recovered so much that he said to his father, I want you to build me a house across the street. Now, many of you probably have seen that house, and maybe some of you have even been in it. It's now the home of the Chester Chidboy Funeral Home. That's the house Ed had his father build. And why did he have it built? Because he had just got married. 6 weeks after being wounded, he was in Philadelphia getting that ball extracted that was in his chest. And then he showed back up with the Army. The Army was now on the Rappahannock across the river from a town called Fredericksburg. You know anything about Fredericksburg? It was in December. Cold, snowy, and it was an attack up a hill that just literally slaughtered thousands of men. The Bucktails and the Pennsylvania Reserves were clear down on the left. And the Bucktails said, we see a way to get around this. We can turn the flank of the Johnnies. They were all in this sunken road, using it like a trench. We can get up there. Well, they talked to other people in the army and said, no, 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 we got to put more men up at the front. Men who can't get going any farther because they're literally walking over their own wounded and dead. Well, attack they did. Again, Ed Irvin was out front. He was right with the color guard. And the color guard had something kind of special. They had lost their flag in the swamps, in the Chickahominy swamps. It seems that Ed Irvin's mother, Jane Patton Irvin, had made a beautiful silk flag for the Rassman Rangers when they went to Harrisburg. They pulled that out and they were carrying it. Color guard was 13 men. They were out front with all the boys following, Ed Irvin leading. I read an excerpt of a letter years later, and it said to folks at home, you probably heard something about the festivities. Well, me and so-and-so are here in the hospital. There were 13 of us. 10 are dead, and we 3 are here in the hospital wounded. The shell that killed Porter Smith from Curwensville took off my coattail. A second later, my haversack went flying as the bullet went into my hips. Ed Irvin, he was hit in the arm and had his arm broken. 6 weeks after he got back, he's wounded again. The flag, well, Porter Smith's blood gushed all over that flag. But it was mixed with the blood of the other 12 men who carried that flag. John Looney from Ridgeway carried the flag, and it was literally shot off at his hand. But when they brought it off the field, it was no longer the Irvin flag. Forever and a day, it shall be called the blood-stained banner. Literally shot to ribbons and coated in the blood of the color guard and Ed Irvin. Well, Ed Irvin came home, got better, and tried to get back into the Army. They said, you're not fit for regular duty, but we'll give you a staff job. And so he resigned. He said, I can do more for the town of Curwensville than be on some staff somewhere. If you know anything about Curwensville, this cemetery was given to Curwensville by the Irvins. Their park, the Pee-wee's Nest, we now call Irvin Park, named after Ed Irvin. Ed Irvin ended up being a lieutenant colonel. He was considered one of the bravest and best officers of the war. Well, that's about it. We can mosey on up to the gazebo. If you have any questions, meet me at the gazebo, and if I don't know the answer, I'll come up with a good, convincing why. But one thing I do want to just mention to everybody. When we Bucktail reenactors did the very first reunion, we came right here to Ed Urban's grave. We laid a wreath and we shot over the grave. Hadn't been done in 150 years. Well, as we were standing in line after taps had played, cold, clear voice said, "Now you're getting it right. It's not the battles, it's the boys. It's not the battles, it's the boys." So when we were done, I turned to my first sergeant, who I had a touch of elbows with. I said, "Bob, you really said something right." He said, "I never said anything. I didn't hear anything. Nobody else heard that, but I did." I think Ed was trying to speak for the boys. If you don't think of anything else, remember, it's not the battles, it's the boys. Thank you. You've been a real attentive group. And thank you for sticking with me.
Thanks, Gary.